Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 6. If you don't like conversation in a book, skip this chapter. Betsy opened the door and was greeted by her kitten, who ran to her, purring and arching her back to be stroked. "Well," said Aunt Abigail, looking up from the pan of apples in her lap, "I suppose you're starved, aren't you? Get yourself a piece of bread and butter, why don't you, and have one of these apples." As the little girl sat down by her, munching fast on this provender, she asked, "What desk did you get?" Elizabeth Ann thought for a moment, cuddling Eleanor up to her face. "I think it is the third, from the front in the second row." She wondered why Aunt Abigail cared. "Oh, I guess that's your Uncle Henry's desk. It's the one his father had, too. Are there a couple of HPs carved on it?" Betsy nodded. His father carved the HP on the lid, so Henry had to put his inside. I remember the winter he put it there. It was the first season Mother let me wear real hoop skirts. I sat in the first seat on the third row. Betsy ate her apple more and more slowly, trying to take in what Aunt Abigail had said. Uncle Henry and his father? Why, Moses or Alexander the Great didn't seem any further back in the mists of time to Elizabeth Ann than did Uncle Henry's father. And to think he had been a little boy, right there at that desk. She stopped chewing altogether for a moment and stared into space. Although she was only 9 years old, she was feeling a little of the same rapt wonder that in the past were really people, which makes a first visit to the Roman Forum a thrilling event for grown-ups. That very desk. After a moment she came to herself, and finding some apple still in her mouth, went on chewing meditatively. "Aunt Abigail," she said, "how long ago was that?" "Let's see," said the old woman, peeling apples with wonderful rapidity. "I was born in 1844, and I was 6 when I first went to school. That's 66 years ago." Elizabeth Ann, like all little girls of 9, had very little notion how long 66 years might be. "Was George Washington alive then?" she asked. The wrinkles around Aunt Abigail's eyes deepened mirthfully, but she did not laugh as she answered, "No, that was long after he died, but the schoolhouse was there when he was alive." "It was?" said Betsy, staring, her teeth set deep in her apple. "Yes, indeed. It was the first house in the valley built of sawed lumber. You know, when our folks came up here, they had to build all their houses of logs to begin with." "They did?" cried Betsy, with her mouth full of apple. "Why, yes, child. What else did you suppose they had to make houses out of? They had to have something to live in right off. The sawmills came later." "I didn't know anything about it," said Betsy. "Tell me about it." "Why, you knew, didn't you, that your Aunt Harriet must have told you about how our folks came up here from Connecticut in 1763 on horseback. Connecticut was an old settled place then compared to Vermont. There wasn't anything here but trees and bears and wood pigeons. I've heard 'em say that wood pigeons were so thick you could go out after dark and club 'em out of trees, just like hens roosting in a hen house. There always was cold pigeon pie in the pantry, but just the way we have doughnuts, and they used bear grease to grease their boots and their hair. Bears were so plenty. It sounds like good eating, doesn't it? But of course it was just at first. It got quite settled up before long, and by the time of the Revolution, bears were getting pretty scarce, and soon the wood pigeons were all gone." "And the schoolhouse where I went today, was that built then?" Elizabeth Ann found it hard to believe. "Yes, it used to have a great big chimney and fireplace in it. It was built long before stoves were invented, you know." "Why, I thought stoves were always invented," cried Elizabeth Ann. This was the most startling and interesting conversation she had ever taken part in. Aunt Abigail laughed. "Mercy, no, child. Why, I can remember when only folks that were pretty well off had stoves, and real poor people were still cooked over a hearth fire. I always thought it a pity they tore down the big chimney and fireplace out of the schoolhouse and put in that big ugly stove. But folks are so daft over newfangled things. Well, anyhow, they couldn't take away the sundial on the window-sill. You want to be sure to look at that. It's on the sill of the middle window on the right hand as you face the teacher's desk." "Sundial?" repeated Betsy. "What's that?" "Why, to tell the time by when." "Why didn't they have a clock?" asked the child. Aunt Abigail laughed. Good gracious, there was only one clock in the valley for years and years, and that belonged to the Wardrens, the rich family in the village. Most people had sundials cut into their windowsills. There's one on the windowsill of our pantry this minute. Come on, I'll show it to you." She got up heavily with her pan of apples and trotted briskly, shaking the floor as she went, to the stove. "But first just watch me put these on to cook, so you'll know how." She set the pan on the stove, poured some water from the tea kettle over the apples, and put on a cover. "Now come on into the pantry." They entered a sweet-smelling, spicy small room, all white paint and shelves, which were loaded with dishes and boxes and bags and pans of milk and jars of preserves. "There," said Aunt Abigail, opening the window. "That's not so good as the one at school. This only tells when noon is." Elizabeth Ann stared stupidly at the deep scratch on the windowsill. "Don't you see?" said Aunt Abigail. "When the shadow got to the mark, it was noon, and the rest of the time you guessed by how far it was from the mark. Let's see if I can come anywhere near it now." She looked at it hard and said, "I guess it's 4:30. She glanced at it hard and said, she glanced back into the kitchen at the clock and said, "Oh, pshaw! It's 10 minutes past 5. Now my grandmother could have told that within 5 minutes just by the place of the shadow. I declare, sometimes it seems to me that every time a new piece of machinery comes into the door, some of our wits fly out at the window. Now I couldn't any more live without matches than I could fly, and yet they all used to get along all right before they had matches. Makes me feel foolish to think I'm not smart enough to get along if I wanted to without those little snips of pine and brimstone. Here, Betsy, take a cookie. It's against my principles to let a child leave the pantry without having a cookie. My, it does seem like living again to have a young one around to stuff." Betsy took the cookie, but went on with the conversation by exclaiming, "How could anybody get along without matches? You have to have matches." Aunt Abigail didn't answer at first. They were back in the kitchen now. She was looking at the clock again. "See here," she said, "it's time I began getting supper ready. We divide up on the work. Anne gets the dinner, and I get the supper, and everybody gets his own breakfast. Which would you rather do, help Anne with the dinner, or me with the supper?" Elizabeth Ann had not the slightest idea of helping anybody with any meal, but, confronted unexpectedly with the alternative offered, she made up her mind so quickly that she didn't want to help Cousin Anne, and declared so loudly, "Oh, help you with the supper," that her promptness made her sound quite hearty and willing. "Well, that's fine," said Aunt Abigail. "We'll set the table now, but first you better look at that applesauce. I hear it walloping away, as though it was boiling too fast. Maybe you'd better push it back where it won't cook so fast. There are the holders on that hook." Elizabeth Ann approached the stove with the holder in her hand and horror in her heart. Nobody had ever dreamed of asking her to handle hot things. She looked around dismally at Aunt Abigail, but the old woman was standing with her back turned, doing something at the kitchen table. Very gingerly the little girl took hold of the handle of the saucepan, and very gingerly she shoved it to the back of the stove. And then she stood still a moment to admire herself. She could do that as well as anybody. "Why?" said Aunt Abigail, as if remembering that Betsy had asked her a question. "Any man could strike a spark from his flint and steel that he had for his gun, and he'd keep striking it till it happened to fly out in the right direction, and you'd catch it in some fluff where it would start to smolder, and you'd blow on it till you got a little flame, and drop tiny bits of shaved-up dry pine in it. And so, little by little, you'd build your fire up." "But it must have taken forever to do that." "Oh, you didn't have to do that any more than once in ever so long," said Aunt Abigail briskly. She interrupted her story to say, "Now you put the silver around while I cream the potatoes. It's in that drawer, a knife, a fork, and 2 spoons for each place, and the plates and cups are up there behind the glass doors. We're going to have hot cocoa again tonight." As the little girl, hypnotized by the other's casual, offhand way of issuing instruction, began to fumble with the knives and forks, she went on, "Why, you'd start your fire that way, and then you never let it go out. Everybody that amounted to anything knew how to bank the hearth fire with ashes at night, so it would be sure to last. And the first thing in the morning, you got down on your knees and poked the ashes away very carefully till you got to the hot coals. Then you'd blow with the bellows and drop in pieces of dry pine. Don't forget the water glasses. and you'd blow gently till they flared up, and the shavings crossed, and there your fire would be kindled again. The napkins are in the second drawer." Betsy went on setting the table, deep in thought, reconstructing the old life. As she put the napkins around, she said, "But sometimes it must have gone out." "Yes," said Aunt Abigail, "sometimes it went out, and then one of the children was sent over to the nearest neighbor to borrow some fire. He'd take a covered iron pan fastened on to a long hickory stick and go through the woods—everything was woods then—to the next house, and wait till they had their fire going and could spare 'em a panful of coals, and then, don't forget the salt and pepper, he would let it home as fast as he could streak it. To get there before the coals went out. Say, Betsy, I think that applesauce is ready to be sweetened. You do? You do it, will you? I've got my hands in the biscuit dough. The sugar's in the left-hand drawer in the kitchen cabinet." "Oh, my!" cried Betsy, dismayed. I don't know how to cook." Aunt Abigail laughed and pulled back a strand of curly white hair with the back of her floury hand. "You know how to stir sugar into your cup of cocoa, don't you? But how much shall I put in?" asked Elizabeth Ann, clamoring for exact instructions so she wouldn't need to do any thinking for herself. "Till it tastes right," said Aunt Abigail carelessly. "Fix it to suit yourself, and I guess the rest of us will like it. Take that big spoon to stir it with." Elizabeth Ann took off the lid and began stirring in sugar, a teaspoonful at a time, but she soon saw that it made no impression. She poured in a cupful, stirred it vigorously, and tasted it. Better, but not quite enough. She put in a tablespoonful more and tasted it, staring off into space as she concentrated her attention on the taste. It was quite a responsibility to prepare applesauce for a family. It was ever so good, too, but maybe a little more sugar. She put in a teaspoonful and decided it was just exactly right. "Done?" asked Aunt Abigail. "Take it off, then, and pour it out in that big yellow bowl, and put it on the table in front of your place. You've made it. You ought to serve it." It isn't done, is it?" asked Betsy. "That isn't all you do to make applesauce." "What else could you do?" asked Aunt Abigail. "Well," said Elizabeth Ann, very much surprised, "I didn't know it was so easy to cook." "Easiest thing in the world," said Aunt Abigail gravely, with the merry wrinkles around her merry old eyes all creased up with silent fun.